Again, good morning to everyone. And I want to know, I'm sure that everything went well with you, and if you have anything you would like to share in reference to last weekend when we were actually focusing on where we are in our on this journey, and at the same time having a deeper desire for change to take place. Also, I want to know if there are any questions that you may have. So if there's anything you would like to share or any questions you want to raise, please do that. Yeah. Okay. If we go along and there are questions, you feel free to raise them. However, I want to look at something based upon what has been taught a few weeks ago. I want to approach baptism again. And the reason I want to do that is because there are people who still are struggling with the whole concept of baptism and the idea of being able to get into heaven after having been baptized. To refresh you, in what we have seen in the scriptures is that John spoke of him baptizing with water, and the one who would come would baptize with the Holy Spirit. And then in the 7th chapter of John, it references Jesus and being the one who baptized with the Holy Spirit. And then the explanation of that is that the Spirit had not yet come because he had not yet been glorified. The glorification of Jesus is not the crucifixion. Because if crucifixion was the glorification, then we must understand that crucifixion was a method for capital punishment devised by the Romans. So Jesus was not the only person who was crucified. So we talked about the glorification of Jesus being our embracing what he taught and living based upon what Jesus taught, which means that we would be living up to the image that we were created in. And in doing so, or by doing so, we would be glorifying Jesus. And we talked about the difference between the water baptism and spiritual baptism. The idea of water baptism, as I said, was, I think I may have to start over. For those who are just coming on, I'm actually doing a review of what we talked about in regards to John's baptism and the purpose of it and the baptism that Jesus would bring into the earth. John's baptism being that of water and Jesus being that of the Spirit. And we have been taught that without baptism, there is no entrance into heaven. And when the question was raised, what about babies? Well, that's different because they're innocent. But if you are baptized in age, you've not been baptized, then that's a problem with you entering heaven. And all of that was referring to water baptism. Yet the scripture clearly tells us that John's baptism of water, the baptism of water, with water rather, ended when John introduced Jesus to Israel. And at that point, the baptism was to be by the Spirit. And I want to speak to that for a moment, and then I want to speak to something else in regards to that baptism. Well, let me do this first. The baptism, if baptism has anything to do with heaven, then what has happened in the last year and a half with all those people who have not been baptized and wanted to be, but could not go to church to be baptized, and they died? Are we saying that they went to hell simply because they were not baptized? The idea of having to be dipped in the water in order to get to heaven the scripture does not bear that out at all. That is denominational doctrine based upon Catholicism. And it has been deeply ingrained in us to the point, to the extent that once we get baptized and we do anything we want to do, then we die. You go to the church and the only thing they talk about is your glowing life because you've been baptized. And one who has not been baptized is a very kind person, loves people, and would do anything for anyone. They die, they're in hell because they were not baptized. That the scripture does not support that at all. And as I said, the idea of spiritual baptism is when Jesus is glorified. When Jesus brings balance to your life, when you allow the teachings that were given by Him, when you allow those teachings to become who you are, it is at that point that you are baptized by the Spirit, rather, because baptism speaks of an immersion into something, and you've been immersed into spiritual understandings when you embrace the teachings of Jesus. Now, we also have been taught that spiritual baptism has to do with speaking in tongues. Some of you on this phone may not have heard of that or even been taught that. However, I do know that there's a great number of you on this phone who has been taught that. And the reason I know that is because I taught you. And I taught you that out of sheer ignorance. And I do understand that when you learn better, you teach better. When you see where you've erred, you admit that error and you correct it and move forward. We've been taught that if your spiritual baptism is there, you know you've been spiritually baptized when you speak in tongues. The question is, where do we get that from? We got that from the charismatic/holiness church. And that is not true. If that were true, then the baptism of the Holy Spirit would not be available to anyone who does not speak in tongues. And maybe at some point we can get deeper into the idea of what this means when we talk about speaking in unknown tongues. But right now, for all intents and purposes, I want to look at it from the perspective of being spiritually baptized. The immersion of the teachings of Jesus. If to be immersed in the teachings of Jesus, you have to speak in tongues, then why is it that the apostles did not speak in tongues when they embraced the teachings of Jesus? What has happened is that we have, let me see if there are any questions before I go forward. Questions or comments? Okay. What has happened is we have taken the symbols to be more important than the meanings. What am I saying? We, as a people, have allowed the symbols of spirituality to become more important than the meanings. Our power, the power of the meanings associated with the symbols have been lost. The force, the power to be free has been lost because we've been looking for the symbols to free us. There is a marked difference between the symbols and the meanings of the symbols. A difference between the symbols and what's real. One writer says that the reality is the meaning, and the symbols is like the plastic. It's the facsimile of something. It's not the real thing. It's only a representation of the real thing. Are you following me?
Yes.
Yes, but I have.
Could you say that over? I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You said you have a question?
Did that make
Okay. Was it you, Audrey? And Ron?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Who? I have kind of a question, comment. The apostles, when the apostles spoke in tongues, it wasn't just to speak in tongues. It was for the purpose of communicating what was going on to other people who spoke those other languages, right? So what's the purpose of us speaking in tongues when as a symbol of receiving the Holy Spirit? Because we're not communicating to other people who need to hear the message. So what's actually the purpose?
I don't want to get into the weeds on that, however I will. The purpose that has been given for speaking in tongues is for the elevation of those who speak in tongues versus those who don't. We never really gave any credence to that until the charismatic church became Project, which is nothing but an offshoot from the Holiness Church. And what happened is the Charismatic Church separated itself, elevated itself to a place of prominence, to a place that said that it had a better understanding of spirituality and could get things done through God because they spoke in tongues. Speaking in tongues without an interpreter, Paul says, is a waste of time. It has no merits whatsoever. I have been in the presence of those who spoke in tongues, and there was no interpreter. And I'm sure all of you have been as well. Everybody speaking in tongues and nobody interpreting, contrary to what they say they believe in terms of what Paul taught. The speaking in tongues, as the Charismatic Church taught it, meant that you knew more than the denominational religions knew. I was in a setting, I was teaching in a ballroom in a hotel, and that morning on my way to the session, prior to my getting to the room, I could hear people speaking in tongues. And I was in the hallway and the doors were closed. When I entered the room, I didn't say anything. I sat down, and when I was introduced, I got up and I said to them what I just spoke about. Paul said there should be an interpreter there. No one was interpreting. But then the greater point that I put emphasis on was this. If I didn't know God and I walked down the hall or entered this room and you were doing all of this gibberish, I wouldn't want to know God, because it makes no sense to me if I don't know anything about the Scriptures. All I hear is a lot of babbling and don't know anything about what's being said. I never got invited back to teach for that group again after that, needless to say. So, at that period of time, I also laid heavy credence on speaking in tongues. And I also believe that there had to be an interpreter. However, I have come to understand, as Audrey has spoken, that the tongues were other languages, and people were understanding in their language. And when it speaks of the unknown language or unknown tongues, it's speaking of a language that you don't know. It's not as complicated as we have made it. What we have done, we have taken the symbol of speaking in tongues and lost the meaning of speaking in tongues. Just as we have taken the symbol of immersion baptism and lost the power that comes from baptism.
So is that idolatry? When we take the symbol and make it mean more than and elevate ourselves because we think we can do it?
Yes, ma'am. It is unconscious idolatry, yes. Because idolatry is when you take an object and you attribute more power to that object than you do to the meaning of that object. That's idolatry. When you make that object a deity. And we have deified tongues by virtue of teaching that you cannot be baptized in the Holy Spirit without speaking in tongues. That's a deification of tongues, of other languages. And that indeed is idolatry. Any questions about that?
Pastor Jay, so
Yes.
is it like, what do you think about like the communion table, the pulpit, and all those other things?
I'm going to get to that in a second, okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
I want you to know the tongues, and then there was someone else who was asking a question when Audrey spoke. So I want to get Audrey's question answered as best I can, and any other subsequent questions on that, then go to the person who was raising the question as she was. Are there any other questions about the issue?
Sage, that was Vermel who interrupted Audrey. My apologies. You answered my question.
Okay.
Answering Audrey.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Hey, Reb, and good morning, everyone. Speaking in tongues, and I've heard it on one or two occasions, and it is said that an interpreter has to be there to interpret what is being said. If I don't understand what you just now did, whether you have an interpreter there or not, I can't believe it no way. So that has always been my gripe about the interpreter, because I can only believe the interpreter if I believe the interpreter. If I trust the interpreter, then more than likely I would believe what they are interpreting by what is being said by way of tongue. If I do not believe the interpreter, it doesn't matter what he or she say. So that has always been my gripe of someone is speaking in tongues and someone has to translate. If I don't know what you said, I can't.
But what you're saying, George, makes all the sense in the world. It works both ways. If you can't understand, if you don't trust the interpreter, you don't trust what the interpreter says. That is no different than what we teach. When right now, speaking of water baptism having no effect other than church membership, I'm interpreting the scriptures. So if you don't believe the interpreter of the scriptures, then what do? You go to the scriptures and you look for yourself and you see it there. Now you trust the interpreter. So if someone is speaking in tongues and someone is interpreting, if it does not line up with what's in the scripture, then you should not believe it at all. However, if that interpreter is translating and the translation is in line with the teachings of the scriptures, then you embrace it. And you might not understand it totally, but it will resonate with you if your desire is to understand the truth of what the scriptures say. Does that make sense to you, George?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Now, I'm in George. It makes sense to me, too.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else?
Yes, Pastor. Good morning. This is Kathy. I have a question along the lines of what we're speaking of this morning. Many, many, many years ago in Greater New Faith, when we went through that period of having some members who spoke in tongues who are no longer in the church now, there was one Sunday when they were up and they were speaking in tongues, and I had a conversation with you about this because as I talked with you later, I was saying to you what they were saying, and you said you were interpreting what they said because I heard them saying it in just a normal language, but they were saying it in tongues. So I didn't even know that was quote unquote interpretation. So in a situation like that, when you don't even know that you're interpreting, if you're sitting there and you're hearing spoken English language and they are saying something in tongues, how does that scenario fit into what we're saying? That's only happened to me once. And I've been around many people who, in the charismatic setting, who've spoken in tongues. That's the only time that ever happened to me because I didn't even realize. And it wasn't that I was up trying to interpret anything. I just heard it in English as opposed to whatever they were saying. So what is that experience? How do you bring understanding to an experience like that?
That is desire. There are periods in our lives when our desire is pure. The Creator will work with us through those desires until we get to a place where we are matured enough to embrace what's really being said in the Scriptures. If we had not gone through the religious rituals and the charismatic symbolism, we would not be where we are now. Each sector of our growth has been based upon what was being taught versus what's in the Scriptures. We did not begin to see the depth of the Scriptures until we continued to search for a greater understanding of not only what we had been taught, but what we were teaching also. And during that period of time, the Creator allowed certain things to happen in our lives in order for us to continue this journey. I remember having interpreted myself, and now I understand that there are people who are genuine and they still speak in tongues. And I do believe that there are allowances made until people mature no differently than when you are rearing children. There are allowances made for those children until they learn better. And when they learn better, the expectation is for them to do better. There are times when you may be in the presence of someone who is, quote-unquote, speaking in tongues, and you still get an understanding. It's simply because of the immaturity of the one who's doing the speaking. It doesn't mean that they are condemned for expressing what has been taught. We would have died on the hill of having to be baptized with water in order for us to enter the gate until we learn better. And that is what sustained us until we got to a place of learning better. Ron said something to me, and this may illustrate it better than what I'm saying. He was talking to a friend of his, and he said, he told the friend, I share with you what we have been taught and what we teach, but I don't share the details with you because I don't think that you can handle them right now. And that's what I'm trying to say in regards to your question, Kathy, that we are given understanding, yet there are certain details about the understanding we don't receive at that time because our level of maturity is not there. Where we are now, it doesn't matter what is said. If we see it lining up with the Scriptures, we are able to embrace it. Why? because we have matured to a place where we are beyond the symbols. We are no longer getting caught up on the symbol. We understand that they are only a representation of what's real. Does that help you, or does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Pastor, this is Ron. I want to talk about water baptism for just a second. Can I back up that far, or you just want to?
By all means, yes. And Evelyn, I'm going to get to the symbolism of communion as well.
It just dawned on me that if we are discovering the scriptures for the first time, which we have been in the last couple of years, then neither have we fully understood water baptism. When you were speaking earlier, I could see a baby being born, and you striking the bottom of the baby's feet to quicken his breath and to make the baby to breathe. I see water baptism as a part of that, or a symbol of that, rather, as a new birth or a new beginning. And it just dawned on me to make that connection, that the water baptism was an invitation for us, as most of the scripture is, I think, to invite us back to beginning. You immerse the person, and the person comes up and he catches his breath as though he's starting a new life, or starting seeing things anew or fresh for the first time. So I just sort of want to point that out, that we talk about the spiritual baptism, and even the water baptism may be something that we miss, that, as again, most of the scripture is an invitation to take us back to beginning, and that is no different than that.
And in regards to water baptism as well, the symbol became so much stronger than the meaning until we lost sight of how to baptize. Because baptism is the type of mikvah, and mikvah is speaking to the washings that took place at the tent, where Aaron and his sons were integrated into the priesthood, or brought into the priesthood, I should say. Well, integrated is fine, because Melchizedek was a priest prior to them. Anyway, the idea of mikvah baptism was, it was not supposed to be done in standing water, like a lake or pond or a baptismal pool. Baptism was only supposed to be done in water that flowed. And that is the reason John baptized in the Jordan, because the river flowed. And the reason for that is, the symbolism of it was, when you are baptized, when you enter the stage of the washings, then all of those things that you needed to separate from would flow away from you in that water. It wasn't that it actually flowed in the water. It was a symbol of what was taking place, the separation from those things that beset you, and the embracing of those things that strengthen you. And that was done until Messiah, or until the Messianic consciousness entered the earth. And the entrance of Messianic consciousness came through the teachings of Jesus and others. And I do emphasize, and others. That Messianic teaching was sent in order for people to understand that it is through spiritual immersion that we are most able to disentangle ourselves from those things that has in the past blinded us to the reality of what spirituality is. And when we embrace the teachings of Jesus, then the symbol of the washings are no longer needed. So I see very clearly what you're saying, Ron. And just as the water baptism was a type of mikvah, and it did speak to the beginnings, it also, the spirituality of it rather, also leads us to beginnings. When Jesus spoke to Nicodemus about returning to beginning, he spoke to him about something different than the baptism. He spoke to him about spirituality. And he told him that the Spirit was just like a wind. Nobody knows where it goes, where it comes from, etc. So Jesus at that point was emphasizing the reality of what? Of being baptized in the Spirit. If we follow the life and teachings of Jesus, what we see is that Jesus moved further and further away from the idea of water baptism. Why did Jesus submit himself to baptism? The reason was so he could be manifested in Israel, so they could see who he is. He was not recognized by John because of his desire to be baptized. He was recognized by John being able to see beyond the seen, and that is seeing the spiritual nature of his essence. And that's what John meant when he said that he had been told the one upon whom the dove rests is the one who is to come. And that dove represented the spiritual essence of what Jesus represented. So when Jesus was physically baptized in the water, that was a message to Israel, his submission to John, who was the voice crying out in the midst of the wilderness, meaning crying out in the midst of all the confusion that was taking place. And with this having taken place, the baptism of Jesus, that is, with this having taken place, that spoke to a movement from the rituals to the spiritual. It spoke to the idea of moving from a symbol to a concept, which has the power that the symbol is supposed to point to. Does that make sense, Ron?
Yes, sir. It does. Thank you.
Is there any questions about that?
I got a question, right, to Charles. When you said the wilderness, I know you probably spoke onto it. When you said the wilderness, what do the wilderness represent besides what you just said? Or
actually, the wilderness simply it represents a battle with your consciousness. It represents confusion as well as a struggle. The struggle is to separate from those things which are an impediment or which are a wall that stands between you and your understanding of who you are in relationship to the Creator. And that wilderness experience that Jesus had speaks totally to that when it speaks to the adversarial thoughts that he was refusing to entertain. And those, again, what happened is because of European ignorance, we accepted the adversarial thoughts as being a living being, a devil, a Satan, that was challenging Jesus, as opposed to them being Jesus' thoughts, which were adversarial. And all of us have adversarial thoughts that we have to contend with. So it is in our wilderness that we contend with those adversarial thoughts. And in doing so, we are able to make a choice as to whether or not we're going to embrace the adversarial thoughts. The question becomes, are we going to seek rulership over the kingdoms, meaning are we going to seek, in our vernacular, the material wealth that's being offered or we've been tempted with over spiritual understanding of who we are? That's an adversarial thought that we have to contend with. Submission to what is real is a great way of making sure that we are able to recognize very quickly adversarial thoughts and not justify them as being something that would enable us to move beyond the place where we are and give us more time to do other things. Because everything that we need to get to where we are supposed to be in terms of our understanding will be added. If there are material things that we need to get to the place where we are destined to be in terms of our understandings, then those material things will be added without us having to fight for them above the opportunities that we are presented with to understand the reality of our spirituality. And I hope that helps all of you.
Yes, it helped me.
Good. Thank you, sir. Anyone else? Evelyn asked about the symbolism of communion. I realized, and I've spoke to someone about it, that since we moved into the other building, we have not engaged in symbolism. And our desire, let me back up a moment. One of the desires at Great New Faith from the beginning was that we only move into a place that the Creator provided for us, as opposed to making every effort to raise money to build a structure. Now, we had that in our minds at one time, but we abandoned it when we realized that that building that really was a cubby hole downtown was our wilderness, or our cave, I should say. It was a place where we were able to contemplate where we were and how we were going to understand to a greater depth what it meant to be what we call the first century church, because we didn't know any better. And when our understanding got to the place where we were able to teach it in a simplistic way for others to embrace. When that happened, we moved to a more visible structure. And we talked about the city being located on the hill, and we realized later that's where we were. When we moved to that structure, we saw a lot of things happening. When we moved to that structure, we've begun to see the disintegration of the control and manipulation of the association. We started to see the power of the spoken word, and didn't even realize it. At least I didn't anyway, until later. The power of the spoken word in terms of being able to enhance the desire for spirituality by virtue of teaching what we were teaching. We also ended up putting a baptismal pool in that building. And that, was, of course, was before we understand what we do now. And it's funny because when we did it, we did it with all intents and purposes of baptizing, of course. And it was in the ground. Well, it is in the ground, as would a mikveh be in the earth. And it is set up so that the water will flow through it. But anyway, what happened is, because of our desire to be in line with the Scriptures, even before we understood what we do about baptism, we were never able to use that food. We've never used it. And the irony of it is that when Mr. Crawley, Kathman's daddy, was ill, he said that that's where he wanted his funeral to be because he knew he was in the process of transitioning. And what we had to do in order for that to take place, we had to build a platform so that, because we knew that the gathering was going to be large, because he, the type of man that could not say no if you needed him to do anything. That's just who he is. And we covered it. We built a structure around it, and quite frankly, I believe that the Creator, in conjunction with the transition of him, made it virtually impossible for us to use that pool. It was covered and still is. And the structure around it is pretty heavy. So it would have to be dismantled pretty much for it to be used. Not only that, we had all intents and purposes of coming into that building and celebrating our interest in it with communion. That never happened. And now that we understand water baptism versus what Jesus brought, we understand that the water baptism was a symbol of the spiritual baptism, what was to come, and that spiritual baptism entered this earth realm when Jesus is glorified. And the communion, Jesus said of the communion that you do this as often as it takes for you to remember me. Now, Jesus did not institute communion. The priests were drinking wine and breaking bread long before Jesus entered a body and came into this earth. They did communion, what we call communion anyway, at Passover. They did it to remember being free from Egypt. And Jesus said, do this as often as you may remember of me. What Jesus is saying is this. If it takes this, the breaking of bread and drinking of wine, for you to remember the teachings or to remember what I represent, then do it. It is a symbol that points to the reality of the teachings of Jesus. It is not a prerequisite for entering, quote unquote, the kingdom. Neither is it a prerequisite for you to enjoy the principles of enlightenment, which is heaven. It was a prerequisite for it was not a prerequisite for anything. It was simply a ritual that points to something greater. And the greater that it pointed to was not the crucifixion. It was a remembrance of the teachings, the messianic concepts that Jesus taught. Not only that, but Jesus, the man, was simply a symbol saying to us, just as this human was able to see not only in this realm but also into the other realm, to see the spiritual nature of everything and understand the principles that the principle of the kingdom, but not only that, but able to deal with the circumstances that he lived in, knowing that the battle against the European domination, the Roman government, was not going to be overthrown with a sword. Rather, it was to be overthrown with the teachings, meaning that the teachings are more powerful than the sword, because just as the teachings reveal to us the descendants of Africa, these teachings were also able to prick the hearts, powerful enough to prick the hearts of the European occupiers. Even when it didn't, things would happen to force it. Meaning, when the centurion went to Jesus, he went to save his child and recognize the power of the spiritual essence of Jesus by saying, you don't have to come to my house. All you have to do is speak the word. All of these things that I'm talking about, these events, are symbols that point to the power that's inherent in knowing who you are. And it points to the power that we have to teach others so that they will understand that just as Jesus is, just as we are, so shall they be if they desire that. So when we talk about the communion, it is a simple foreshadowing of something, and what it foreshadows or what it points to is the remembrance. So if you are able to remember the teachings, to bring them to your memory when you are dealing with circumstances and situations, when you are able to be guided by those principles, then there is no need for you to do the wine and the bread. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yes. I have another question, too.
But just before your question, Evelyn, especially those of you from Great New Faith, can you see what's been explained about our moving from one building to the other?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So in doing that, the building does not represent, the building is simply a symbol of the spiritual reality of what happened when we moved into that place. So it is not the reverence of a building, it's the reverence of what we understand about what that building represents. It is a symbol that represents a spiritual reality. Okay. Any questions about that?
I saw it as this, Charles. I saw it as when we left Egypt, that's the other church, and we went into the wilderness. The building was our wilderness, so we can hear and understand what God was teaching us, rather than seeing the way the people was going. They weren't going the right way. They were just doing things just for money or just prestige. So we was there in that wilderness learning all about the Father.
Yes, thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
The Catholic Church have a bunch of symbols that they do in their building, and I know that they have a lot of meaning of the symbols that they do, but they keep it from people, or either they turn it, they use it for control.
Okay. The idea of embracing the symbols had its genesis in Christianity in the Catholic Church. However, the difference is that for the most part, they understand what the symbols represent. Yet, due to their desire and the reality of their manipulation, they are unable to harness the true power of what those symbols represent. And because they have made a fortune, and because they have been able, through brute force as well as scriptural manipulation, been able to indoctrinate and enslave people to a religion that does not have any power whatsoever, they have stuck to that because it's worked for them. The whole idea of wearing a cross is superstition. A cross can't save you. The cross is no different than wearing a replica of a gas chamber around your neck, or a noose, or a replica of the electric chair. All of those are means of capital punishment. And that's what that cross represented. It doesn't represent Jesus at all. It represents capital punishment. And if we look at it through what is called Egyptology, the understanding of the symbols of Egypt, if we look at it when in actuality it is understanding the Cushite meanings of these symbols, the cross represents a barren womb, and what is deemed to be the Ankh, that is a cross with the opening at the top, it represents a womb that is able to bear children. So the symbols that are worn and the meanings that we attach to a number of them is not what they actually mean. However, if you desire to remain in ignorance and wear symbols simply because somebody told you something, as opposed to you knowing what they mean, then that's how the universe will respond to you. It will respond to you based on your ignorance. And that is the reason there is so much confusion, violence, racism, greed, manipulation in the church. Because the attachment to these symbols that's been embraced by those in leadership has actually relegated us to being at the mercy of the universe itself. And if you hold fast to them, then you will see the results of it. And I do believe that greed, racism came from greed. And greed came from selfishness. And the idea of selfishness is bred within the confines of the church because you got to save yourself. And because you prosper with God when you give to the church, or when you give yourself to the church, when you're baptized in the water, that kind of thing. So all of these symbols or have been described in such a manner that they do something for you and not for humanity. The cross that's worn, the baptism that's employed, those kinds of things. Evelyn, does that help you with the communion?
Yes, sir. But every time you see like football players, when they do some type of whatever, they'll do the cross in their chest. They'll make that cross thing in their chest. Then you got the Catholics that have that smoke coming out of a container. And I know those things mean something positive, but like you said, it's not to help mankind do anything or to grow or whatever, but yeah, it's just like they have so many of these symbols and they still controlling people. So that's why I brought them up as well.
The rituals, you're right, baby. The rituals are designed to control people, to keep people in a certain state of being. The burning of incense is what the smoke that you're talking about in that little thing that they have when they walk down the aisle to get rid of the evil spirits, that kind of thing. This is no different. This is no different than the symbol of holy water, and it works. There is no need for it anymore. And the reason there is no need for it is because of the embracing of what Jesus taught. And when you embrace what Jesus taught, it is not necessary for you to, quote unquote, cast out demons. What is necessary is for you to teach and change the perspective of people. Think about it this way, especially in regards to what Catherine raised earlier about speaking in tongues and interpreting them, and my response to that. Think about this. I, as have a great number of you on this phone, have experienced people who we considered demonically possessed. And we proceeded to cast out those demons, and I learned how to make holy water and sprinkle, and it actually worked. Now, why did it work? It worked because my teaching and my belief had not gone beyond what Moses did with the holy water. And the idea of casting out demons was our belief that we could make someone better or bring them to a place of balance, even though we weren't talking about balance then. We were talking about freeing them from the adversary. So if if they were not possessed as we thought they were, what happened? The adversarial energy overpowered what was believed to be spiritual energy. What am I saying? The creation of an adversary being in a person came from the teachings. Therefore, when these adversarial thoughts overpowered the teachings of the church, it was deemed to be a possession. And all we were doing when we laid hands on them, anointed them with oil, or used the holy water, all we were doing was overpowering that adversarial energy and infusing the energy of righteousness, or the power of righteousness. And that is what brought them to a state of awareness of their surroundings again, and release them from the control of that adversarial energy. The reason it was these people were subject to that energy of the adversarial energy is because of the powerlessness that the church actually had in terms of its teaching. So you say, well, why were you able to do that? Why were you guys able to do that? Why were there people able to do that? Because the desire was not to be on a pedestal. The desire was to be a deliverer from misery and bring someone to a state of righteousness, even though we did not understand the veracity of what we were doing. That was our desire. And it happened. It happened in spite of our ignorance. It happened because of the depth of our desire to free that person or those people from that adversarial state of being. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, sir.
To those of you who have encountered demonic experiences, and I use that in air quotes, does that make sense to you?
Yes, sir.
Anyone else? Does that make sense to you?
Oh, wait. Can you run downstairs and put those clothes in the dryer?
I'll put them in the dryer. Does that make sense to you? Anybody?
It makes sense. It also reminds me of the statement that you made some years ago. The closer you get to God, the more ungodly it seems. It seems like our whole perception of things have changed, and that desire that you talk about, as we saw salvation, as we're seeking salvation so many years ago, it looks totally different than it does now, because that what we were taught to seek did not include all of mankind to the degree that it does now. So things look entirely different than they did at one point.
Yes.
As your understanding and your awareness grows, so does your vision. And you also you've moved to a point where you recognize that Ron is not Ron just for Ron. Ron is Ron for the entire universe. And that becomes apparent and clear, and your desires go along with that.
So, Pastor, you're saying that it wasn't the holy water. It was because you had a pure motivation and intent.
Yes.
Okay, I get
it. And the funny thing about it is, when the holy water is made, you have to infuse it with your energy. Even though I did not know they're called praying over it, but you have to do that in order for it to work. So that it's an infusion of the positive energy. And it has been proven that your attitude can change the molecular structure of water. I have a book with the scientific proof in it somewhere around here, that your attitude changed the molecular structure of water. And if your body is 97% water, then the molecular structure of that water is changed based upon your attitude. Therefore, if you are in a state of depression, anger, or anything that is adverse to the teachings of Jesus, then you can change the molecular structure of water. You can change the molecular structure of your body by virtue of your attitude. And you don't have to deal with such misery. So, any other questions?
Well, Rev, one thing I wanted to say about the Catholic Church, and this is very much opinionated. For about 12 to 14 years of my life, out of my 50, I really thought that the Catholic Church was humble and meek, just based on its symbol, and the symbol that I'm referring to is the Pope. In the Reagan and Bush era, that Pope looked like he couldn't even bathe his own self, looked like he wouldn't harm a fly. So I thought that the Catholic Church mirrored the Pope, and it's not true. By way of the symbol of just the Pope, I mean, the Pope that we have now, he's probably one of the most animated popes we've had. But just by that symbol of the Pope, I just always thought, and one reason I thought that, because growing up United Methodist, we have something called the affirmation of faith. Yep. And in the affirmation of faith, you got to give the kudos back to the Holy Catholic Church, the community. At one time, I knew it by heart.
Well, you pledged your allegiance to the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so just by symbols, be very careful of them. Just in your everyday walk of life. Just because something is wrong, if it looks wrong to me, I'm very much out of balance because it looked wrong. if it look good or sound good, I'm out of balance because it look good and sound good. Some degree of investigation has to take place. So these kind of wildernesses that we create for our own self, just because it's good and it sounds good, Reverend Richard say some things, it sound good. When he talk about Richard Marx, it sound good. I'm gonna go read up on Richard Marx, and I do find it sometimes insulting that when I tell someone something and they just roll with it. You ain't gonna look up what I said. You just roll with it because it sounds good.
Well,
and that's it. That's it, man. Well, I mean, and on the hindsight of that, you animated when you think what I said is wrong, and you ain't got no information. So I mean, just be mindful of the symbols out here that they use to captivate us. One symbol that they use in marketing is colors. The colors of psychology or the psychology of colors. When you're going down Interstate 26 and you see them orange cones gonna do something to your body. It's a captivating color. This is why a fire marshal will tell you kids shouldn't play with matches, not because it's so much dangerous, because it is. It's what that color orange can do to you. It can draw you in. So this, I mean, I don't know if that got anything to do with symbols or not, but
no,
just be mindful of it.
We are talking about religious symbols, and when we look beyond the symbols and embrace the power that it represents, it is at that point that the symbolism that we encounter every day has less effect on us. In some cases, no effect on us. Why? Because we have embraced the power of the universe, as opposed to having embraced the power that's found. The powerlessness that's in those symbols. And when you speak in regards to Catholicism and talked about the animation of the current Pope, it is that type of animation that brings people to a place of servitude, because they see that animation as something positive, and that positivity that they think is there what draws them in and relegates them to being an eternal servant, and to validate that as being something that is righteous, as opposed to being what it really is, a method of manipulation. And don't forget that the beast of religion has two heads, and that is current existence of the Catholic Church right now. The Pope that abdicated is still living, and the Pope who's currently in that position is not in a position of total control, because he has a constant battle with the Pope who supposedly abdicated. And now that whole sector has two heads, and it is the monster that it has always been, pretending to be something righteous. And if that monster has two heads and pretends to be something that it isn't, then everything that monster birthed has two heads as its leadership. And I am speaking to the Protestants. I am speaking to any group that has as its origin the Catholic Church. I'm speaking to any group that has as its origin Christianity in its symbolism. we are in a constant state of bombardment by symbolism. And if we don't refuse to embrace the symbolism, then we have serious problems still ahead of us. The world is in the condition that is in because of symbolism. I know some of you have received in your email or in your text messages these chain prayers, the symbolism. If chain prayers were going to be effective, then everything in this world would be in a righteous state. The chain prayers are a superstition as well as the cross and other symbols. If these chain prayers work, why hasn't anything changed? The chain prayers speak to the God that the church invented. It speaks to the type of prayer that the church instituted. If our Creator will only hear us if we do chain prayers, then something is wrong with our Creator. What am I saying? Jesus says that don't be like the hypocrite who stands on the corner praying with the multiplication of words, saying the same things all the time, over and over again. Vain repetition is what he calls it. Chain prayers of vain repetition, hypocritical, pretending to be something that they are not. That's what a hypocrite is. The hypocrisy is a damnable thing, because if you see, let's look at COVID. If you see COVID as a raging fire and you continuously pour a thimbleful of water on that forest fire, you never put it out. Why? Because that thimbleful of water is a symbol of what you have been taught is the solution to extinguish that raging fire. That's no different than having been taught that a chain prayer is going to bring an end to COVID, or anything else for that matter. We have to understand that the idea of prayer, the reality of prayer, is not the words that we speak. It is more so the meditative experience that we encounter every single time that our focus is on the enhancement of humanity as opposed to the destruction of something. Does that make sense? Questions, comments? Are there any questions or comments about any of this?
I have one, Reb. The question I wanted to ask about what Ron had said, like you said, the closer and closer you get to God, he don't look like the God that We were always taught
Yeah.
to understand. So,
Right.
so the way I see it, the closer and closer that you come to God, you keep seeing the more of yourself. The closer you get to God, the more you see of yourself.
Yes.
Okay, I understand now.
Now, please understand this for Charles and Ron and everyone else on this phone. When I made the statement, the closer you get to God, the more ungodly it appears to be, I had no, it came out. I said it. The depth of understanding of that, I had none. But I do believe that it was the Creator warning us, saying to us, don't recoil when you begin to see what Elohim looks like. Don't run away simply because it doesn't look like anything that you thought it would look like or anything that you were taught. I do believe that that was a created issue and that type of warning to us, even though I had no clue as to what that meant. I felt it from the depth of my soul that that was a reality. And it has proven to be true. So the reason I keep going back to the things that I have taught, the things that we have experienced, is because I don't want anyone to think or believe that I have always understood what I understand now, or I have always taught what I teach now. I want you to understand that my journey came from being religious. My journey came as a result of the people who truly believed what they believed. They believed what they were taught. And the reason I am where I am in terms of my understanding, and prayerfully that where you are as well, is because of the questions that were never answered. The questions that were raised in me that I could not get answers to. And in search of those answers, this is what we found. Or it found. Well, we found it because it's never been lost. We were lost to it. Any questions or comments? Okay, the last thing I want to say in regards to this is when you are engaging other people in conversation, don't have them to feel that you are where you are, been there all the time. And don't speak to them as though they're less than you. You don't talk down to people. You talk to people. Don't present as much as you question. Meaning that if they are engaged in you, ask questions. And be like the attorney is. An attorney does not ask the question that he don't know the answer to. So ask questions. And when they give you an answer, say, could it possibly be, as opposed to saying, this is what it is. Do you think it could possibly be this? And that raises questions with them. And it does not, it does, it minimizes, if not eliminates, controversy. Because when it becomes controversial, that's the end of the conversation. They're not going to hear anything else you have to say. That's what I want to leave you with. And are there any other questions before I ask something of Sheldon? Or Janice, either one of you guys online. Are you on? I know Sheldon is. Janice, are you on? Okay. If there are no other questions, I would ask if everything from September, at least September, could it be uploaded?
Yeah, I will speak with Janice to make sure everything through September is uploaded.
Thank you, sir. Okay. Any other questions or comments? I hope this discussion today has enhanced your understanding, or at the very least raised questions within you that will bring you to a place of understanding. It is my deep desire that we rise above symbolism. And when we move beyond the symbolism, we become what is pointing us to. We become the teachings of Jesus. We become the embodiment of the baptism by the Spirit. We become the embodiment of all of the spiritual essence of what these symbols are pointing us to. The symbols are pointing us to something. They are not the power. They are not the reality. They are simply the physical representation of the spiritual truth, and they have no power whatsoever. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to our gathering tomorrow. Goodbye.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.